Hey, Changemaker! Welcome to Learning for Good, the only podcast that teaches nonprofit leaders how to leverage training to drive performance, improve capacity, and fuel their mission impact. Do you ever feel like your nonprofit is growing, but your people just aren't keeping up? Or like you're fixing the same problems over and over? Do you wonder how to build confident, capable staff who know how to lead, not just execute? If we haven't met yet, I'm Heather, and I know how hard it can feel to get people to do what's expected of them. Trust me, I have 3 kids. I've tried telling people what to do and how. I've tried the traditional training approaches, and I realized that just doesn't work. And that's when I started researching what does work. Now, I help mission-driven leaders use learning to drive performance, build capacity, and make change that lasts. And I'm sharing it all on this podcast. So block your calendar, turn off your Teams or Slack chat, and let's dive in. It's Learning for Good.
How much training does a volunteer really need? And how do you reach them? I volunteer on the parent-teacher committee at my child's school. You didn't receive any training for that. I read over some bylaws and started attending meetings, got elected into a position. I volunteered for several years with the headquarters of the sorority I was in college. I attended a training for that, but it was more of a convening, I would say. And within that convening, we were able to learn a little bit more about what we were doing and meet with our committees and things like that. I volunteer as a track and field coach at my daughter's school, and I lead other volunteer coaches in that particular role. We have had mandatory training for that because there are children involved, but nothing specific to our role in track and field. I give these examples because some volunteer roles don't need as much training as others. For the parent-teacher committee, reviewing all the documents gave me a lot of insight into how that committee runs, what was expected of me, and how I could contribute meaningfully. I didn't need a full training for that. But when we're talking about more involved volunteer roles, mentors or camp leaders in the case of my guests today, we knew they're going to need some training. But volunteers are not the easiest audience to reach. They are already giving you their time as a volunteer, and asking for more time for training can feel challenging, and it can sometimes be met with resistance. But it's necessary. And I know many of you are facing the same challenges as you train your volunteers. So I'm excited to have Jim Farmer with me on the podcast today. Jim is a nonprofit learning leader who spends a lot of time thinking about the volunteer experience and how he can train them to succeed in their roles for the safety of the children they serve and for the impact their organization can have. Let's dive in. It's Learning for Good. Jim Farmer serves as Vice President of Training and HR at For the Children, a faith-based nonprofit equipping local churches to create life-changing moments for children in foster care through Royal Family Kids camps and mentoring programs. With more than 15 years of experience in leadership and learning and development, Jim's passion is helping ordinary people become extraordinary volunteers. Under his direction, FTC has reimagined how volunteers are trained, focusing on trauma-informed care, spiritual formation, and practical leadership that equips every person to serve with both heart and excellence. Beyond his role at FTC, Jim also serves as chair of the board for Harvest India and has spent over a decade as a volunteer, camp director, and church elder. He's driven by a simple belief: when we train people well, we multiply impact, and every child deserves to experience that impact firsthand. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Heather. I am really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited for our conversation. I know there are quite a few organizations that are training volunteers, and they're a little tricky for an audience for training. And so I'm excited for this conversation. I know so many people are going to benefit from that.
Excellent. Me too. And having been a volunteer and then also training volunteers, I've definitely been on both sides of that coin.
When you're already giving your time and then to attend a training, even if it's necessary, right, there's a little bit of, okay, here we go again. But It's so important. And not just from a safety perspective, not just from a risk perspective, which is important, but to do your job meaningfully as a volunteer. That it's important. So I'm excited we're going to talk about it. Before we get there, I want to hear about your career journey. How did you get here in this training HR role at For the Children?
A great question. So I'm going to have to jump back quite a ways because there's been some parallel lives happening for me. But I actually got my start in my learning and development career at the happiest place on earth, Disneyland Resort in Southern California. I started in operations and moved into management, and then was tapped to help teach their traditions orientation program, which was really my first foray into training and development. And I loved it. I loved connecting with people in that way. I loved being a storyteller and bringing people into that culture, and eventually worked as a training manager for the resort, where I was working with operations leaders on their training programs and creating classes and content and creating processes for how they would train frontline staff on roles in attractions and custodial and housekeeping and security and you name it. And so from there, I went into the L&D field in other companies. I actually dipped into the finance industry for a while and worked for a large international bank doing leadership training and development, and eventually found myself working in healthcare, working for a number of healthcare companies and training employees on leadership growth and organizational structure and things like that. But at the same time, while I was at Disneyland, I got pulled into For the Children as a volunteer, thanks to a friend who had gone to a camp the year prior and came back with really his life changed and said, if you want to stay friends with me, you have to come serve at this camp with me this summer. And so I volunteered at my first Royal Family Kids Camp, which was one of our For the Children programs, knowing nothing about foster care, nothing about children who had experienced relational trauma. In fact, I really walked into my first training with the idea that most of the kids that we were serving were orphans. And that's like sad. And it was probably because their moms or dads like died tragically in a car accident. It was not like little orphan Annie perspective on orphan care. I didn't really think about the fact that they were in the system because their primary caregiver, the person that's supposed to be caring for them and caring for their needs, couldn't or wouldn't care for them. And that usually looks like abuse, neglect, and some other sort of relational trauma with really heartbreaking stories. And so it really opened my eyes to what I was getting myself into. I went to that first training session, and I've stayed a volunteer for many years since. I went on to be a director for a Royal Family Kids Camp through my church. I helped the national office train as a volunteer trainer, and then eventually found myself working here when they called with this opportunity. And it was just a marriage of my professional career at that point and my passion.
Yeah, taking the plunge from corporate to nonprofit. I'm sure that could be a whole episode in and of itself. What what you found, how that transition went. There are so many similarities and so many differences at the same time. And how awesome that you've had the experience as a volunteer coming into an organization and helping you make that transition. So before we get into the volunteers that you're training and what that looks like, tell us a little bit about For the Children as well. I know I shared a little bit about the camps and things, but what does the organization do? You mentioned that you serve at foster care, children in foster care. So tell us a little bit about that. And then where does training fit? How does training support all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our organization has been doing this for over 41 years, starting here in Southern California. And now we work with and partner with churches in 44 states and 9 countries doing our programs. And so we have 2 core programs: Royal Family Kids Camp, which is a 5-day overnight camp, residential camp for children in the foster care system between the ages of 6 and 11 or 12. And then we also have added a Royal Family Kids mentoring program that our chapters can do, which continues some of the conversations and the relationships that form at camp into a mentoring relationship that happens throughout the school year. We have a unique model in that our organization operates like a franchise. So each church that joins our network becomes a trained chapter, and they are responsible for finding the volunteers to be the camp directors and also all of the staff that support the camp. And those directors are responsible for finding the camp location, for finding the volunteers in their community, for fundraising, because it's not an expensive endeavor to do a 5-day camp overnight, and also are responsible themselves for training. And we set the standards and the expectations for that. So we have 2 layers for how training supports our organization. When a chapter director is being designated as that leader for the chapter, they have to go through training with us. And so for camp directors, they either, if they've never been to a camp before, they come to a 5-day in-person training that we host at one of our active campsites. So they can spend time in the classroom with me and one of our director trainer volunteers, learning about our organization, learning about our model, learning about all of the ways that we keep our kids safe in our programs. We talk about how to fundraise, how our curriculum is shared, how we balance the relationship of a church working with local state agencies and government agencies, and what we can and can't do with that balance in mind. And then they also get to experience camp. So they get to see the model happening in front of them. They get to go out and observe the activities that the camps have put on. They get to observe and interview counselors and hear more about what their experience is like in the other roles that we have at camp. And it's a week-long way. So it feels a little bit like training and a little bit like a retreat, but it's incredibly impactful. And then we have an online option for existing chapters that are just looking to maybe refresh their leadership team or are doing some succession planning. So those are folks that have already been to camp and know it really well. But we'll do an online live facilitated Zoom training for them for 4 days. And then our mentoring program goes through a similar process with a slightly adjusted agenda as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful to have that context of how the organization is structured and who is being trained and how you're delivering that training to them. So obviously you're training volunteers. The directors are likely on staff at a church, just not your staff. Does that sound right? Or they also
No, so this is still mind-blowing, but our directors are also volunteers.
Okay. All right.
With few exceptions, but they sound like a full-time job, and it kind of is. But they're doing it as a volunteer, which is incredible.
Yeah. It's an incredible gift of time and skills that they're giving. So as you're training these volunteers, what makes training volunteers different than training employees? You trained employees over the course of your career, and now you're training volunteers. What makes this different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the biggest challenges is the volunteers are coming to training, whether it's my chapter director leaders or our volunteers in the community being trained by the chapter director staff. They're coming in with very different levels of experience. The one commonality is most of our volunteers have little to zero experience working with kids who've experienced trauma. So that is helpful in an orientation setting, right? We can kind of lay that core groundwork around concepts of caring for children who've experienced trauma. But beyond that, everything else is very wildly different. In a corporate setting, you have a sense of who the employees are, even if you don't know them personally. You know what their role is, what their experience is in the role, and if they're either signing up for or being told to attend a class on coaching and development, you can kind of level set that expectation for where people are at. But our volunteers are coming in with all sorts of different experiences. So some are 18 years old and are freshmen in college, and some are 75 years old and are retired from, a corporate career as an executive or as a school teacher. And so they all have very different experiences around things like communication, things like delegation, things like having difficult conversations, especially when we're training our directors. So finding ways to both bring in new information and remind and refresh folks that have already maybe experienced that and apply it, teach them how to apply it in this context is probably the biggest challenge, but also the most exciting part of our training.
Do you wish you could connect with other nonprofit learning and development leaders? I know what it feels like to want someone to bounce ideas off of and to learn from, someone who really understands you and your work. Imagine if you could have a simple way to meet people in the field, ask questions, and share information. That's why I created the nonprofit Learning and Development Collective, where nonprofit L&D, talent management, and DEI leaders can connect with each other quickly and easily in a virtual space. When you join this community, you will walk away with a new, diverse, and powerful network and a sounding board for your staff development needs. So if you're ready to exchange ideas and collaborate with your peers, come join the nonprofit L&D Collective.
What are some of the other challenges that you face when training volunteers?
So I think the other biggest challenge is the timing. Like you guys have picked up on, it's a big commitment to even just serve as a volunteer. And for our directors that need to maybe send someone else to training, oftentimes those folks have done camp for a week or the mentoring program for the year. And then we're asking them to, in some cases, fly to a different state and take another week off of work or away from their family and attend training. So that's really our biggest challenge. And one of the things that we're continually trying to solve for. How do we leverage technology in new ways so that it requires less time for folks? But unlike in the corporate environment, where in many cases it was just easy to move a class entirely online, I'm finding that because of the spiritual aspect of the work we're doing, it demands a high relational experience just from a kind of a pouring into and ministry perspective, but also because this is really hard work. And it's really story-driven work. And when you get folks into a room together to learn, the stories come out, the heart comes out, and you can really connect with their heart in a deeper way, which is also important because we want the volunteers to stay invested for quite some time. It's a big investment of training up front. We don't want them to go out the back door in a year. So that in-person relational time is really important. So just trying to find that balance is a needle we're always trying to thread.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of organizations are trying to figure out how to get things to volunteers in a way that isn't a barrier. And moving things online is often a solution, whether it's self-paced or a Zoom type situation, like you mentioned. But when you're trying to build those relationships in a deeper way, that does become a little bit more challenging.
Yep, absolutely.
So you've also mentioned a few times just the amount of care that goes into this. Specifically, you're using a lot of trauma-informed care principles in your learning design and how you're approaching training volunteers, but then also how you're helping volunteers engage with others. So what impact has trauma-informed care in your learning had on volunteers in this volunteer workforce that you're working with?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer it in two ways. In some ways, it's been completely transformative. In the other way, it's actually been the thing that we've been doing for 40 years and just didn't have the language for it. So at our organization, we do a lot of training in trauma-informed care. We particularly use a trust-based relational intervention, which is a philosophy of trauma-informed care out of the Karen Purvis Institute of Child Development in Texas. And I've been trained as a practitioner for that, as well as many of our staff. And a lot of our volunteers have, on their own time and own dime, gone through practitioner training, even for themselves, which also just speaks to like the incredible dedication. My volunteers are the best. So they're very dedicated and I love that. But what's been so great is we get to incorporate the language of trauma-informed care into really practical methods for our volunteers to take home. The challenge is every chapter is in a different place in their understanding and their expertise around the language of trauma-informed care. So we have to be mindful of that change management journey for folks. And so we have chapters, like I mentioned, that have practitioners themselves. And so they understand the best practices, how to best connect with kids that maybe are in an emotional red state and are able to train the volunteers on how to do that. Others are just learning the language and are at the very beginnings of that stage. And so we provide some core foundational training for them. But one of the things that I'm really excited about is we've recently launched a specific training track on trauma-informed care for our chapters, where chapters can nominate one or two volunteers to do a deep dive training. It's an 8-week online course and then a 1-day in-person experience where we do the deeper work on trauma-informed care, what that looks like, how that shows up in the chapters that we have. And then those folks are able to help train their volunteers and their chapters. And during the camp or the mentoring program, come alongside the volunteers when they're having maybe a difficult moment with a child and act as that coach for them. I think the hardest thing to overcome from a learning perspective in this space is many of us bring our own experiences into how we interact with these kids, especially volunteers who are coming into this pretty cold. So we're going to interact with the kids like we were parented, or if we are parents, how we parent our own kids. And sometimes that's great, but it doesn't always translate for kids that have experienced trauma. So those coaches and our trained practitioners can really do that like shoulder tap and say, hey, why don't you try a more playful engagement to get them to transition to that next activity versus what you were doing? Or next time, if you give them a 5-minute warning so that they can prepare for that transition, that will make that a lot smoother for you. So we found that to be a really effective way of training and empowering our staff to do that.
I think I need that in my household. I need a little parent coach, right? Who can, this is why it didn't go well. You should try this instead next time.
Yes, I think that might be a great reality show. We should do that as a side project.
I think it might be a little bit different than what was the Super Nanny show or whatever, right? Be a little bit of a different approach. So as you're thinking about, I know even inside the nonprofit L&D Collective, we have several organizations that train volunteers, and it is just a little bit different, a little bit more challenging, or different challenges maybe. So what advice would you give to someone who is building their volunteer training program or looking to enhance it, update it in some way based on lessons that you've learned? What advice would you give in this process?
Great question. And, I'm a year into my role here, a year and some months. And so I've had to really take a step back and prioritize needs. And so my advice is to prioritize. You might need to take some time to really understand what it is your volunteers need first, and then design towards that. And then you can layer on over time. I find that because we need to balance the time given for training and honoring that with the information that we need to communicate, sometimes that means that all of the things that I want to share that I think are super important need to really be broken out into drips instead of floods. And it's a balance, because if people are taking time out of their daily lives and you have them for a day or half a day, there's that tendency to fill it with as much information as you can to honor their time. But if you overstuff it, then they're going to forget it anyway. We know this as professionals, but knowing and doing are often very different for many of us, myself included. So really trying to focus in on that. What is that core message? Like, what is that thing that they need today? And I can find other ways to get them those reminders at other times, whether it's an email, a podcast, a link, instead of trying to brain dump on them. So that's one advice I have. The other I would say is, because oftentimes volunteers are volunteering to give back to the community, it is by nature a communal experience. And so whether you're training in person or you're training virtually, finding a way for people to connect with other volunteers or with you and the staff is key. And if you aren't doing it in person, that's okay. But maybe there's a half hour or an hour call that they can hop on and meet the team or ask questions, or you can even just do something fun with them to build that sense of being seen and known and cared for by you as the organization. That just fills the volunteers' tank so that they're more equipped to serve in whatever way they're being asked to serve.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I know that people are listening to this like challenged, right? Sitting there trying to think about, how am I going to apply this in the training that I'm providing to volunteers? How am I going to reach them? How am I going to get them to build these relationships? How am I going to understand their needs, prioritize, like you said, and not just kind of brain dump, which is a slippery slope that I think we see in a lot of training, not just volunteer training. So thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing this information, for sharing your experiences with training volunteers. Like I said, I know a lot of nonprofits deal with this, and I think it's fairly unique to the nonprofit sector. And so getting this opportunity to sit down with you today is really valuable.
Thanks, Heather. It was my pleasure, and it was fun to talk about something that I love doing.
Absolutely. Training volunteers is no easy feat, and Jim has figured out a way not just to train volunteers, not just to reach them, not just to get them into the training, but to help them develop the skills they need to engage with the youth, the children that they are serving. And so it goes beyond even just compliance or safety and risk. It really is about how do we create the environment? How do we help them create the environment that is needed as they're interacting with children? So he's doing such great work. And I'm so glad that we were able to learn from Jim today. If you are a nonprofit employee with training responsibility and this episode was interesting to you, maybe you're training volunteers or you could see how some of the things that Jim shared will be helpful for you, or you're curious about trauma-informed care and training, whatever it was that stood out to you, then I would love to invite you to come join us for our next networking event for the Nonprofit L&D Collective. These events are a perfect way to meet other nonprofit training professionals, ask questions, exchange ideas, and leave ready to take on new challenges at work. I'll see you next time on Learning for Good.
Hey friend, was this episode helpful for you? Did you like what you heard? Do you want more content like this? Here are 3 things you can do. Hit subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast app of choice, share this episode with a colleague. This means so much to me personally. I read every review, but it also helps me learn what content you like most so I can create more of what you want. All right, turn that Teams or Slack chat back on when you're ready, and I'll see you next time on Learning for Good.